Hey guys, I'm the Comics Kid 2099, and I wanted to talk to you about a book that I read yesterday. Superman Dark Knight over Metropolis. As I understand it, I am not a huge Superman fan. I like the character, and I've read a few of his stories, quite a bit more since the Man of Steel movie came out, and that kind of got me more interested in the character and in his series, but I'm not as much into Superman as I am, say, Batman. So I'm not 100% sure if what I'm about to say is accurate, but I think this book is actually the second time that Batman and Superman met each other in the post-crisis universe. So the first time they met would have been collected in the Man of Steel trade paperback, and that was a story where they went after the supervillain Magpie, and then this collects their second meeting, if I'm not mistaken. And it actually collects another meeting between the two. I guess now is a good time for me to go ahead and tell you what issues are collected here. This has, let's see here, Action Comics 653 and 654, Adventures of Superman 466 and 467, Superman 44, and Action Comics Annual 1. The Annual is the issue that is kind of doesn't have anything to do with the rest of this. It's a story where Superman and Batman basically wind up in South Carolina, and they are fighting a vampire and some of her minions, and it's an okay story. It's not really the best. It's drawn by Art Adams, and I'm not a huge Art Adams fan. I know a lot of people really like him. He's not exactly my favorite artist, and the story was written kind of oddly. There's some stuff that I felt like it could have done a lot better just from a writing perspective. But the rest of the story, the rest of the book, doesn't really have anything to do with that annual. And also, there's one issue here. If you've ever heard of the character Hank Henshaw, who in the Death of Superman, he was one of the replacement Superman. He was the cyborg Superman. He was a character who actually existed before the Death of Superman, and basically his motivation for becoming an evil cyborg Superman was revenge on Superman, as I understand it. He was basically an homage to Reed Richards. You have this comic right here. You see these guys right there? This is Adventures of Superman 466, and this was basically a riff on the Fantastic Four, specifically their origin story. And so you've got all these characters who are kind of, sort of, well, not kind of, sort of, they are very analogous to the Fantastic Four. The difference is, this almost makes the Fantastic Four look very glamorous in comparison, because at least all of the Fantastic Four, they survived the experience that gave them superpowers. But with these characters, they're all slowly dying. Basically, they're all very close to death, and Superman kind of has to help them survive. And spoiler alert, I guess I'm going to put my thumb up, and as long as my thumb is up, I'm spoiling, so go ahead and mute the video if you don't want spoilers. Spoiler alert, the only one who actually survives this story is the Sue Storm character. Hank Henshaw allegedly dies, but then, of course, he comes back in the Death of Superman, and he's basically been kind of part of the Superman mythos ever since then. He's kind of been in and out of the Superman comics for a long time now. Okay, so I'm done spoiling. But this issue, Adventures 466, it's also kind of, other than the annual, it's the only one that really doesn't have a purpose being in this book. The Dark Knight over Metropolis story was only 3 issues long, and this book is obviously a lot longer than 3 issues, so they really needed something to kind of pad it out. Now, the annual, I understand that, because it's another Batman-Superman team-up from around this time period, so even though it has nothing to do with the story going on in the Dark Knight over Metropolis story, they still included it because it's very similar. You've got similar characters and stuff. I have no idea why this Adventures of Superman 466 is collected here. I had already read it before, and it's a decent issue. It's alright if you're into that sort of thing. I personally have a soft spot for analogies to other characters. So the Squadron Supreme, for example, is the Marvel Comics version of the Justice League. I'm a big fan of stuff like that, and this was basically that for the Fantastic Four. However, it has nothing to do with Batman. It has nothing to do with this story where Clark Kent, Lois Lane, and specifically Cat Grant are being targeted by Intergang because they all kind of joined together. They joined together to put away Morgan Edge, who's a member of Intergang. And Batman gets dragged into this, and I'm not really going to go over the whole story with you. I will say that this is not the best Batman-Superman team-up that I've ever read. I would say some better Batman-Superman team-ups. If you watched Superman the Animated Series, I think that they did a 3-part storyline. I don't remember what it was called. It might have been called World's Finest, and I think that 3-part episode was better than this. This is not quite, it doesn't measure up to that episode. And also, there was a miniseries written by Dave Gibbons and drawn by Steve Rude, also called World's Finest. I think that was superior to this. And it could be, I've spent many years hearing that this was a really good story, and so when I finally heard that it was in trade paperback, somewhat recently, I went and bought it at Books A Million, and I don't want to say disappointed, because this is an era of Superman that's really good, and I've got a lot of other Superman stories from around this time period, like Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite, which I really liked. You know, those stories are from very close to this time period, and I really like those stories, but I don't think that this measures up to some of the other Batman-Superman stories that are out there. It's not the worst one by any means, but it's also not quite the best. So maybe that's something to keep in mind if you're interested in the hype that surrounds the story. Or maybe you haven't even heard any hype about this story. I've actually, now that I think of it, I've only heard hype from one specific person who is saying that this was a really good story, and it was a decent story. It just wasn't a fantastic story. It's not necessarily something, if someone was wanting some of the best Superman-Batman stories of all time, I don't know if this would even make the top 5. So that's something to keep in mind. Having said that, this is not a 50-50 Batman-Superman story. This is really more a 70-30 Superman-Batman ratio. Batman is in it a little bit, but he is not overpowering this story. A big fear that a lot of people have of the upcoming Man of Steel sequel is that Batman is going to be too much in it, or specifically a fear that I have is that the rest of the Justice League is going to be too much in it and Superman isn't going to have enough to do. Well, that's not a problem here. Superman is definitely the protagonist of this story. You've got a lot of Superman, a lot of Lois Lane, you've even got a little bit of Jimmy Olsen, a little bit of Perry White, characters like Gangbuster, he's in this, Cat Grant. Those characters all, I feel, get more to do here than Batman does. He is a guest star in a Superman book. This is not a Superman-Batman equal time kind of thing. Batman is in this, but he is not overpowering the main characters of this book, which is a good thing, I think. If you're going to have a guest star, it's not good for the guest star to be doing more stuff than some of the main characters of that book. I don't think I have anything else to say, really. I enjoyed this. I will say this is maybe a little bit spoilery, but since this story is like 20 years old, I think it's okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it. There's a very famous scene that a lot of people are aware of, I think, but they may not necessarily be aware of where it came from. If you are familiar with the scene where Superman gives Batman the kryptonite ring and says, listen, I have been controlled by supervillains, I have been possessed by different things before, it's possible that one day I'm going to be out of control. Something is going to take control of me, and they are going to try and use me for the purposes of evil, and if that day comes, I want someone who I trust to be able to take me down using the kryptonite. And he gives Batman the kryptonite ring. That happens here. It's the very last scene in this story, and it's a pretty well-known scene, I think. Mark Waid definitely played with that scene quite a bit, or he didn't really play with that scene, but he built on that scene in his run on Justice League, in a run that was very underrated in my opinion. And also, I believe Alex Ross also did a story that was kind of playing with this scene, this idea that Superman might be taken over by something one day and Batman's going to have to try and stop him. Alex Ross did a short story based on that. I know I read that somewhere, I just don't remember what it was called. So it's a scene that I think has a lot of resonance with fans, but they may not necessarily know where it came from. It's from this story. So overall, do I recommend this book? Absolutely I do. I know it seemed like I was a little bit negative in my review, but I think it's just that me personally, I had heard that this story was really phenomenal, and I was hearing that it was like way up here, and really it was about right here. It's not bad considering like really, really awful would be like completely in the floor, and you know, when it's not here and it's here, that's not bad. It's still like a B plus or an A minus. You know, that's not really bad. It's just not the story that I was expecting. And that's something that probably other people are not going to have as much of that experience if they read this book. But yes, I would suggest that you read this book, and specifically, I would suggest that you read some of the books from around this time period. Specifically, after John Byrne left the Superman books, that's when it really got good for me. I have said before, I am not a fan of John Byrne's run on Superman, and I may do some videos on that in the future. I've talked about that, but it's been a long time. I'm not really a fan of John Byrne's run, but after he left, when you had people like Roger Stern, Louise Simonson, Jerry Ordway, those guys were really killing it on Superman during that time period, and I've really enjoyed, I think, everything that I've read from that time period. I don't think there's a single story from that era that I just really did not like. I'd say my least favorite one was probably the one that introduced the Eradicator as an entity, as opposed to just a plot device. I don't remember what it was called, but it was after the Exile story. But that was probably my least favorite one, and even it wasn't bad, it just wasn't really my thing. I'm getting off topic. That's about all I have to say here. Get this book if you can find it. It's a fairly new book. It only came out like in November of last year, I think. I found it in my Books A Million, so you could probably find it in your local comic book store or Books A Million or something like that. Go ahead and get it. I recommend it, and I think you will really like it. So that's all I have to say here. I will talk to you guys tomorrow with a different kind of video. Until then, I'll see you guys later. Have a good day.